Hello everybody and welcome to a new section called Creating a Compelling Bootstrap 4 UI. Our first video is creating forms and inputs, and in this video we are going to take a look at what are the basics of HTML forms and inputs, how does Bootstrap come into play in terms of forms, what can we do with Bootstrap, what kind of elements does Bootstrap support, and of course, how can we customize these elements to our liking. So to get us started, I've simply created a login page on our project, and of course you will be getting the source files, so you will be able to follow along. But basically our page provides a registration page where the user can simply create a new account. So as you can see, we have a couple of standard elements like the input type of text, input type of email, and of course the input type of password. And you see here we have a bit of help text and of course the mandatory I agree to your great terms of service checkbox. So to get a feel on how this looks like, let's take a look at the code. So I've basically created a container followed by a row and then a column D of 6. Now I chose the column D of 6 because I don't think this form needs to span all the way from start to finish. By that I mean all 12 columns. If we try to see how that would look, it might be a bit weird. So this would be the 12 column grid system, which I think is too much. So we'll keep it at 6 columns just so we have a better layout. Now this is where things get interesting. Now you open up a form element just by calling the HTML form element, and of course in real life you would provide it a method of post or get, or even sometimes other methods like put and patch. And of course you do need an action where basically your server side will probably collect all this data and register the user, so something like register / and that's it. So but more interesting are the Bootstrap HTML elements for forms, or better yet the way we create them. Basically the form elements are kind of grouped in this div called form group. So each form group, as you see, contains a specific element, and the reason for that is because Bootstrap does some additional styling to make sure your form looks always great. So for example, it always adds a margin of 1 rem to every form group. That's why by default you see that there's a little bit of spacing here, which makes things look better. Now if we move on, you can see that we have our label, which is just a standard HTML label element. And of course, we can always add some of our own classes to it, or even Bootstrap classes, but in Bootstrap 4, thankfully no class is required by default. Rather, Bootstrap does some default styling. So it's up to you to make sure that this looks like you want. After the label, we have our input elements. So every input element has a type. In general, for general purpose input types like first name, last name, and stuff like that, you would use a text element. So that's why we've added the input type of text. On email, it's input type email. If I had a phone number, it would be input type phone, or input type password for the password. Now, the reason why these different types exist is so that, for example, on your mobile phone, it would open up the appropriate keyboard layout. So, for example, if we were viewing this on an iPhone or Android, it would open a different keyboard layout than this right here. And in the case of password, of course, we want to protect what the user types in, and that's why we use the input type of password. Now, after that, we have our name element, which is standard to every input element, and then we have our required Bootstrap for class, which is the class of form control. And this class gives you some default styling to this element. For example, it places the width to 100%, display block, assigns coloring and stuff like that, and basically makes your inputs look great from the beginning. So again, if we want to customize any of these, we can. It's very easy to override any of these directives, but for now, let's check out what we have. And of course, the placeholder attribute, which will show up if nothing is entered. So right now I haven't typed anything. And if I start typing, that disappears. I would suggest that you always have a label. Don't use just the placeholder because it's kind of counterproductive for the user, especially if there's a lot of input fields. So for example, you can already see that without a label, I wouldn't know what this field would be about. This form might include 10 other fields, and when I come back here, if there are no labels, I probably won't know what is going on. So if we take a look at some of the other styling that Bootstrap uses, we can see that here we have a small helper text which is meant to explain to the user that he must be using a very safe password, and that is done by using small element with the class of form text and text muted. Now again, you don't have to use the small class, it could be a regular div, but in this case it makes our font a bit smaller and it makes the whole form look better. Now if we go back to our code, we'll see that the checkbox elements have a different type of flow than the regular input types. So as you can see in this case, we do have our form group element, but we also need the form check element. Essentially, this wraps the checkbox element and its label inside of this div. So then we can add a new input element of type of checkbox with the class of form check input and your value, of course, which could be anything you want, 0, 1, yes, no, true. And then we do need a new label element with the class of form check label and the text of the label. Now the reason why we need that is because, again, as you can see, this layout has two items. So it has the input type of checkbox right here, which you can click, and the label next to it. Now Bootstrap takes care of all the default styling, so by default you will see this layout. There isn't anything you have to do to get this kind of grid-based layout. And as you can see, this form check input is actually styled absolutely, and this label is display in line blocks, so that's why we see everything in one line next to each other. And finally, at the end of our code, we have a simple button with, again, wrapped up with the form group element just so we get some padding and margins around it. So this essentially breaks down the basics of form elements in Bootstrap. Of course, you can take a look at other different interesting options that Bootstrap has. So these are things like sizing, for example. There are multiple ways to size. You could use classes like form control LG, which will make the input a lot bigger, and form control SM, which will make it smaller. You can always change the Bootstrap code and override its values so that maybe you are going to make something 50% or 70% bigger or smaller. And of course, the best thing about it is you can use different layouts. More interestingly, you could use the whole grid system to display columns, to display input elements one next to the other. So for example, in this case, we see that the first name is left and last name is right. And in this much more complex example, you see a combination of column D6, column D6, column D12, column D12, then I think this is like column D5, I'm not sure, column D, let's see, column D6, and then these ones are column D4 and 2. So again, you could use the whole Bootstrap grid system to control the sizing of these input elements, or you could use classes, and again, you can style them on your own. Now another aspect are the horizontal forms, which again, you get to use different classes, for example, to achieve this in Bootstrap. I don't prefer horizontal forms at all. I just think that these regular vertical forms are much more better to use and to read in terms of the user experience. So I would say stick to that. But again, if you ever need to have a horizontal form, you can. And Bootstrap again comes with some default validation, but again the recommendation is actually not to use it because there are still big differences in native browser validation. So I think you should be better off with a jQuery plugin that would control some of these things, but in essence you do get some great styling out of the box with Bootstrap. And finally, Of course, you can have various designs and custom elements like the checkbox element. So if we, for example, wanted to implement this on our website, all we would need to do is copy and replace our old checkbox code. So if we take a look at how this will turn out, let's just place the new code right here. And let's indent it a bit just so we know what is going on. And again, as you can see, since this is some custom styling, there are different classes. So for instance, in this case, we are using the class of custom control and custom checkbox, which would indicate that we are using something that is different from this. And again, we have the similar elements. So all we need to actually do is copy our text. So if we take a look at how this looks, I think it will look actually much more better. So let's refresh our page, and as you can see, it does look a bit clearer right now, which is great, and we didn't have to do a lot of work to make this happen, so that's always a convenience. And again, you can apply these things on checkbox elements, radio elements, and the select menu, as well as the file browser menu. So if you wanted to upload files, you can use the Bootstrap default styling. But since this is just basic, we will be checking out a bunch of more plugins throughout this section that will address specifically each of these elements and add more functionality to them than Bootstrap does.